Welcome to Communication 200, Mass Communication and Society. This is Professor Jody Gurman at Mendocino College. And this week we're looking at the origins of radio and broadcasting. So our chapter begins with an exploration of clear channel communications, how they grew from 39 radio stations to an industry dominator of more than 1,000 stations between 1995 and 2000. Although Clear Channel is now struggling financially from debt, it's still the largest radio station chain in the country with almost 900 stations. The problem is that there's very little diversity in radio station ownership these days. Women, who constitute 51% of the U.S. population, own just 6% of full-power commercial broadcast stations. Here we have a quote from activist Loris Taylor. She's the executive director of Native Public Media, an advocacy group for the country's 33 American Indian-owned public stations. But let's take a step back and look at the origins of radio. So the telegraph was the precursor to radio. It was invented by Samuel Morse, and it used Morse code in 1844. And then we have Tesla, one of the most interesting inventors in the history of mass communication. He was a Serbian-Croatian inventor who created a wireless device in America in 1892. His transmitter can make a tube 30 feet away light up. And then we have Marconi, Guglielmo Marconi, the Italian inventor, who began experimenting on wireless telegraphy in 1894. He saw his invention as a means for point-to-point communication. Although history often cites Marconi as the father of radio, Tesla's work definitely preceded his, and there was yet another inventor unknown to Marconi making parallel discoveries about wireless telegraphy in Russia. That was Alexander Popov. Just to complicate things further, there were other people claiming credit for the invention of radio, among them Lee DeForest, who liked to call himself the father of radio in defiance of other inventors. He wrote the first PhD dissertation on wireless technology, although to be fair, he was building on others' innovations. DeForest's biggest breakthrough was the development of the Audion, or triode vacuum tube, which detected radio signals and amplified them. It really improved listeners' ability to hear the dots and dashes of Morse code and later speech and music. The credit for the first voice broadcast belongs to Canadian engineer Reginald Fessenden, formerly a chief chemist for Thomas Edison. He went to work for the U.S. Navy and eventually for GE. In 1912, the practical possibilities of wireless technology were exposed when wireless operators saved 705 lives during the Titanic tragedy, which really boosted interest in amateur radio across the United States. Sorry, I couldn't resist a little reminder of the Hollywood version of that. In the wake of the Titanic tragedy, Congress passed the Radio Act of 1912, which addressed the problem of amateur radio operators increasingly cramming the airwaves. It outlined that radio waves are a natural resource and that wireless stations needed a license. When the U.S. entered World War I, the Navy closed down amateur radio. Soon after, we saw the formation of RCA. This was created as a private sector monopoly with government approval to dominate the radio industry. So in the 1920s, we really saw an explosion of radio, with 5 stations in 1921 exploding to 600 by 1923, so in just a couple of years. And then the radio sets that were in American homes reached 5.5 million in 25. And then we have an unraveling of the RCA domination of the industry. AT&T started their first station in 22. The 1920s also saw the formation of the first lasting network of radio stations. NBC, which was created in 1926, was connected by AT&T long lines, and the network broadcasts programs nationally and played a prominent role in unifying the country. One of the most important figures at this time was David Sarnoff, who in 1921, at the age of 30, became RCA's general manager. After RCA bought out AT&T's telephone group network, Sarnoff created a new subsidiary in 1926 called the National Broadcasting Company. Its ownership was shared by RCA, General Electric, and Westinghouse. Then in 1928, William Paley, whose family owned a cigar company, bought CBS and became NBC's main competitor. The Radio Act of 1927 was the first federal legislation to bring order after radio's chaotic rise. This act initiated the policy of operating in the, quote, public interest, convenience, or necessity. In other words, radio had to serve the common good. Although the Federal Radio Commission was intended just to be a temporary committee, it grew into a powerful regulatory agency. In 1934, with the passage of the Communications Act of 1934, the FRC became the Federal Communications Commission. Its jurisdiction covered not only radio, but also the telephone and the telegraph, and later television, cable, and the internet. More importantly, by this time, Congress and the president had sided with the already powerful radio networks and acceded to a system of advertising-supported commercial broadcasting as best serving, quote, public interest, convenience, or necessity, overriding concerns of educational, labor, and citizen broadcasting advocates. The 1930s and 1940s are known as the golden age of radio. Listeners tuned in to favorite 15-minute programs each night. There were variety shows, quiz shows, radio plays, and soaps. Looking at the most popular comedy at the time was Amos and Andy, controversial and arguably extremely racist. It was originally created as a blackface stage act by two white comedians, Charles Correll and Freeman Gosden. And the program was criticized as being racist, but it was the most popular radio series in history. Arguably the most famous single radio broadcast of all time was an adaptation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. On Halloween Eve in 1938, 23-year-old Orson Welles aired the 1898 Martian invasion novel in the style of a radio news program. For people who missed the opening disclaimer, the program sounded like a real news report, with eyewitness accounts of battles between Martian invaders and the U.S. Army. The program created a panic that lasted several hours. FM was developed by Edwin Armstrong and was a dramatic breakthrough in broadcast sound and a better medium for music. And we have the rise of the format of the Top 40 radio, which was inspired by jukeboxes. A station owner invented the idea by rotating top songs. But then there was resistance to the Top 40. The expansion of FM in the mid-1960s created room for progressive rock and album-oriented rock, also known as AOR. Transistor radios were developed in Bell Laboratories in 1947. These enabled radios to shrink in size and be more portable. Commercial radio has become more specialized, with more than 40 different formats to serve diverse groups of listeners. There's news, information, and talk radio, and music formats of a variety of different sorts, like contemporary hits, country, and urban. Buoyed by popular hosts like Rush Limbaugh, the news or talk format is the most popular format in the United States. Here's an example of a radio program log for an adult contemporary station. Format radio carefully manages and coordinates the programs each hour, dictating what DJs will do at various intervals. Here's a breakdown of popularity of various radio formats among people 12 and older. So you can see that news, talk, and information take up 12.6%. And country is hot on its heels with 12.5%. National Public Radio and Public Broadcasting Service were created in the late 1960s and mandated by Congress to provide alternatives to commercial broadcasting. Here's Ira Glass, one of my favorite NPR commentators, and Terry Gross, also a wonderful interviewer for NPR. Two services, XM and Sirius, started offering over 100 music, news, and talk channels in 2002. In 2008, they merged to form Sirius XM Radio. About 2,000 radio stations now broadcast in HD, a technology that compresses digital signals and allows for multicasting. Media convergence is bringing radio back to its roots by providing a wider variety of content to listeners. Emerging in the 1990s, internet radio involves either an existing station streaming its programming on the web or a service like Pandora that creates a radio station based on a user's musical tastes. Internet radio is no longer tied to a computer, though. Audio files are available for download onto devices like MP3 players, smartphones, and tablets. Internet radio sites have also developed apps for streaming radio on such devices. Only about 8% of spending on media advertising goes to radio stations. Since the recording industry doesn't charge for the playing of music, only about 20% of the budget goes toward programming costs for most radio stations. As we discussed in Chapter 3 on music, payola was rampant in the 1950s and caused quite a scandal, but it has not ceased to exist. In 2007, four of the largest broadcasting companies paid $12.5 million to settle a payola investigation. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 was worrisome to a lot of smaller organizations because it eliminated the laws restricting ownership of radio stations. And this cleared the way for companies like Clear Channel and CBS Radio to control the vast majority of stations. Here you can see just a thumbnail sketch of what Clear Channel owns, including almost 900 radio stations. As huge corporations gained control of America's radio airwaves, activists in hundreds of communities across the U.S. in the 1990s started protesting by starting up their own non-commercial or pirate radio stations, capable of broadcasting over a few miles with low-power FM signals. A good question to ask ourselves is whether companies like Clear Channel and other mega corporations taking over the airwaves will restrict the kinds of voices that are allowed to speak and be heard on the public airwaves. Thanks for listening. Tune in next time for Chapter 5 when we talk about television and cable, the power of visual culture.